So I'm talking about new treatments for MPN, and there are a lot, so I can't cover everything, but I am going to talk about some kind of general principles of how we go about trying to develop new treatments. And I also want to talk at the end about an idea we have for something called a priority setting partnership, which is bringing together patients and healthcare professionals working in the field to try and set the priorities for future research in this area. And it's something we'd like to do next year, so I'll talk about that a little bit more. So if we think a little bit about MPN treatments and what we can do to improve things, I think there's a general principle, first of all, that we should always be aiming to do better, whatever the situation. So, always try and improve the way we approach and manage patients. I've set out here some of the areas that I would see as areas of unmet need in the management of MPN. So the first thing is personalizing management for patients. So how do we select the right management approach for the right patient, rather than giving a treatment and then seeing how the patient responds to that particular treatment? It would be terrific if we could actually use some kind of test to say, well, now I know you're going to respond really well to interferon versus hydroxycarbamide or a JAK2 inhibitor treatment and so forth. So I think, this requires a lot of additional genetic testing typically. So that involves introduction of new technologies such as genome sequencing that I won't talk about in so much detail today. There's, I think, a big question as to why people get myeloproliferative neoplasms, and particularly rare cases where these diseases can run in families, although that is the exception and not the norm. For most individuals with MPN, it doesn't have implications for the rest of their family. But also environmental factors. How do we improve survival for patients with more advanced forms of myeloproliferative neoplasms, such as myelofibrosis? And even though we have some good treatments, there is a lack, even notwithstanding Jean-Jacques' talk about interferon. I don't think there's evidence at the moment that even interferon is actually curing patients. It is modulating the way patients' disease behaves in a way, but there is a lack of curative therapies for MPN apart from the more radical type of treatment, bone marrow transplants. So we need therapies that will improve survival and prevent disease progression, prevent complications of the disease, and better treatments to improve symptoms, particularly fatigue is a dreadful symptom that affects many people with MPN and is very difficult to treat, and we need better therapies for that. Okay, so what strategies do we have? So I chair the NCRI, National Cancer Research Institute subgroup for myeloproliferative neoplasms. I took over from Claire Harrison, and Claire took over from Mary Frances McMullin, all giving talks today. So, that's one of the nice things about working in this particular field in the UK. There's such a terrific group of investigators like Claire, who's a real world leader, and Mary Frances, and so on. But the key thing is, I'll show you the kind of trials we've got running in the UK at the moment. There are two main types of trials. There are things called academic studies that are led. I'm a university academic, so I work for the University of Oxford, although I'm also a clinical doctor looking after MPN patients. And academic studies are studies run by someone like me or Claire or Mary Frances, and using a drug that is developed typically by a drug company, but the trial is not actually sponsored and led and fully funded by the company. And those trials are really important because when companies are running trials, they often have quite specific endpoints that they prioritize for those studies that are not, they're kind of influenced by getting the result they want in order to be able to market their drug. It's not necessarily a nefarious thing. It's just something that, they design the trials in that way. And academic studies are often, they've got longer term endpoints, and we try and really bring into the trial measures that are really important for patients in terms of quality of life and symptoms and so on. There are lots of other things that we can do in addition to trials, although I'm mainly going to be talking about the trials we've got today. So taking part in laboratory research projects where samples are collected and information is collected, that can really drive the development of new therapies. So many of you who are looked after in big centres will have the opportunity to contribute to those studies. And I can't overstate how important that type of research is to really drive innovation. Developing new guidelines is important because we need to optimize the way we use the therapies we already have. Observational studies are also important, so not necessarily testing new treatment, but learning how we use the treatments that are currently available, and also making sure that the healthcare professionals working in this field are fully up to speed with current guidelines and so on. But again, at the end, I'm going to talk about how we can involve you patients with these types of conditions more in the actual research setting priorities, shaping the research, shaping the clinical trials that we put effort into setting up so that it meets the priorities that are set by you. So let's think about clinical trials for 10 minutes or so. So here's the, I'm not going to talk through all this because it's a very complicated slide, but I want to get across a couple of key points. Number one, if you look at this side, these are what's called interventional studies. So those are drug trials testing a new treatment in patients with MPN. These are the ones that are actually open in the UK and recruiting. So we've got a lot. There's a huge amount of different things going on. So it's incredibly exciting time in the field, lots of new therapies coming through. Point number two that I think we work hard to try to address is that the red studies are those studies that are sponsored by drug companies, so commercially sponsored studies. The ones in black are the academic studies. So there's a big study I will mention, and Jean-Jacques mentioned the Mithridate study. I'll mention the Tamarin study, and I'll mention the Phasar study. So you can see there's more commercially sponsored studies than academic studies, and that's partly because it can be quite challenging to get these types of drug trials funded in the UK. They're quite expensive trials to run, and that's exactly where I think bringing in patients to bring your voice to the table and show the funders, actually, we've set the priorities with patients. This is what the patients have identified to be the really key trial to do, and that's why we are asking you for money. I think it's an incredibly powerful message, and will help us get some of these new studies, academic studies, funded. Okay, so I just want to touch on essential thrombocythemia and polycythemia vera, where the mainstay of treatment for many patients is hydroxycarbamide. But what are the new therapies or old therapies coming through that we might use? You've already heard about interferon. I want to mention the MAGIC study, which was led by Claire Harrison. This tested patients with essential thrombocythemia and polycythemia vera who were not responding as well as we would like to the hydroxycarbamide treatment, either because of side effects or weren't responding optimally to the treatment. And those patients were randomized to either the best treatments that we had available or a JAK2 inhibitor treatment with ruxolitinib. Many of you in the room probably took part in these studies. So the first study is already published and it had a big impact. It was highlighted as one of the key papers in this particular journal, which is Blood, which is the key journal for hematologists internationally. And it was highlighted as one of the top 10 articles for the whole year. So it's having a real impact, this type of work, led in the UK. And what that study shows is that ruxolitinib was actually no better than other therapies we already had available in terms of normalizing the blood counts and achieving a complete remission. But ruxolitinib was better in this waterfall plot. Anything below this line here means the symptoms are improving, and you can see that the symptoms were improving more in patients that received ruxolitinib versus patients that received best available therapy. So ruxolitinib, not necessarily better at controlling blood counts in ET, but seems to have an important role for improving symptoms, particularly in patients with particular symptoms such as severe itching. The MAGIC polycythemia vera arm has completed recruitment, and we've reported the primary endpoint, but this is not published yet. We will be publishing this next year at some point. This did meet the primary endpoint, so the key thing to look at here is the green bar, and that shows you the patients achieving a complete response. That means normalization of the blood counts, shrinkage of the spleen if that was enlarged, and you can see a much higher rate of achieving that depth of remission with ruxolitinib versus best available therapy. And the trial also showed marked improvement in symptoms associated with ruxolitinib versus best available therapy. So without question, ruxolitinib is an exciting treatment for patients with polycythemia vera, but there is a challenge in terms of getting ruxolitinib treatment at the moment. So the responses were dramatically more sustained with ruxolitinib versus best available therapy in that treatment. And again, in this trial, and again, this is an example of an academic study where we have very long follow-up available, so we can really see these big differences that you wouldn't typically see in more commercially sponsored studies. So that's led on for Claire and others, Jean-Jacques, to develop the Mithridate study, which is a French UK study that is going to recruit patients with polycythemia vera as a first-line treatment and ask the question, what about using ruxolitinib as first-line versus what the physician might choose for that patient, which would either be hydroxycarbamide or interferon. So it's a randomization, first-line, ruxolitinib versus physician choice of hydroxycarbamide or interferon. Importantly, you can already be on hydroxycarbamide or interferon over the past few years and still be eligible for this study. So this is a really important study for getting access to ruxolitinib, which is a very nice treatment. It is not a study that's designed for patients who are not responding optimally to their first-line treatment. So you have to be responding to the treatment like hydroxycarbamide that you might be on, but then it's asking the question, perhaps we can do even better by switching to ruxolitinib treatment. Okay, I'm going to mention and kind of speed through a number of other studies that I mentioned this one last year. This is a typical example of an academic study that I think is really interesting and we would really like to do, but it's very, very challenging to get funding from funding bodies in the UK to move forward with the study. So this is a study that's testing methotrexate, that is a very cheap drug that has been around for many, many years and appears to have activity as a JAK2 inhibitor and is 1,000 times cheaper than ruxolitinib, literally 1,000 times cheaper or thereabouts. So we would like to test, maybe this is a good treatment in patients who are not responding well to hydroxycarbamide with essential thrombocythemia and polycythemia vera. We're still really trying to drive ahead with that study, and there's another funding round that we're applying to try and get funding to run that study. You've already heard about ROPEG, so I will skip over that slide. This is another example of, I think, innovative research in the UK, where we're trying to reposition or repurpose drugs that are already available. You'll have heard of tamoxifen, of course, because of its use in breast cancer, but some terrific research carried out at the University of Cambridge showed that this may have a role in patients with myeloproliferative neoplasms, and it might specifically target the cells carrying the JAK2 or the calreticulin mutation. So the Tamarin study was kind of born out of that, is now fully recruited and should be reporting the outcome next year. So it's another example of really powerful academic laboratory-based research linking up with, and coming all the way through to a clinical study in quite a short space of time. So I've just got one slide on JAK2 inhibitors. I'm sure you'll hear more about JAK2 inhibitors this afternoon in a talk about myelofibrosis, but ruxolitinib is, of course, the one that is approved and funded in the UK. The kind of updates here are that fedratinib has recently got FDA approval for use in myelofibrosis, and there is a phase 3 study planned in the UK, and that'll be for patients with myelofibrosis who are not responding as well as we would like to ruxolitinib treatment. Pacritinib is a treatment that's particularly being developed for patients with myelofibrosis who have a low platelet count, and that can be difficult to use ruxolitinib in that situation. And there's a large phase 3 study planned internationally, including the UK, and that should open next year. Momelotinib, on the other hand, is a JAK2 inhibitor that seems particularly powerful for patients with myelofibrosis who have anemia. One of the problems with ruxolitinib is it can actually make anemia a little bit worse, and momelotinib doesn't seem to have that effect. It's got slightly distinct mechanism of action, even though they're all cold JAK2 inhibitors. They're all different in one way or another, and momelotinib seems to be particularly useful for patients with anemia. And again, there's a large randomized phase 3 study that's in the process of opening in the UK. So you can see there's a tremendously busy and exciting field of research in the UK at the moment. Again, this is very complex. I don't want to talk through this or for you to take any of this in, other than to say, we can do if you like, but depends how long we've got. But the point is that myelofibrosis and myeloproliferative neoplasms are complex diseases, and there are many different things going on to cause the disease and the manifestations of the disease. So often you have to tackle this from different angles. So I think there's a huge array of different treatments all coming through. These are all treatments where there are trials in the UK in myelofibrosis primarily, but also in some other MPN patients, testing these new treatments either alone or in combination with JAK2 inhibitor treatments. So you can see a tremendously exciting time, and I'll give you 2 or 3 highlights of things that are coming through at the moment. So this drug is called luspatercept. This is developed by a drug company called Celgene. This seems particularly useful for treating anemia in patients with myelofibrosis. This has already had some very exciting results in a related condition called myelodysplasia, showing improvement in anemia, and some patients who are blood transfusion dependent becoming blood transfusion independent. So that looks like an exciting treatment. There's some data going to be presented at the annual American Society meeting in December, showing that patients on ruxolitinib with myelofibrosis who are blood transfusion dependent, if they receive this drug, about 1/3 of patients become blood transfusion independent. So it looks pretty interesting. And there's a study that's ongoing in the UK with this particular drug. PRM-151 is an anti-fibrosis agent that has shown some promising results. And again, there's a study that will be opening in the UK to increase the number of patients and to learn more about that. The PHASAR study is a study that's just been completed in the UK. This is for patients who are progressing from myeloproliferative neoplasm to a more aggressive form of the disease, close to leukemia, or actually leukemia itself. And here we were testing a combination of ruxolitinib with another drug that is used in leukemia patients called azacitidine. And that study is finished recruiting and will be reported next year. And this is very much seen, I think, and being established as a kind of standard treatment in this particular disease setting. There's a couple of other exciting treatments coming through, something called MDM2 inhibitors. There's 2 trials in the UK, one with a drug that's made by Kartos Therapeutics, another made by Roche, which is called idasanutlin. It's a very interesting treatment, and there are trials coming through for patients with polycythemia and myelofibrosis. And this is, to my mind, a very interesting and exciting treatment made by Constellation Therapeutics. They're presenting their data at ASH. They're using this drug either in combination with ruxolitinib or as a single agent treatment for patients with myelofibrosis. And the data look pretty interesting. And a number of sites in the UK are actively recruiting, including Oxford and Clare's Centre at Guy's Hospital. So the future, I'm happy to take any questions about any of these areas. There's lots of interest in how to apply gene sequencing, something called gene editing, where you might actually be able to use this very new technology to actually remove the damaged piece of DNA, for example, the JAK2 mutation. Immunotherapy in myeloproliferative neoplasms, I think, is in its infancy, but it's an incredibly exciting field in cancer. And there are people thinking about how to develop a vaccine that might be used against mutations such as in the gene calreticulin, or ways to use antibodies to target the cells that are making excess numbers of platelets. So I think there's very exciting future trials coming in this field. Okay, last minute, I'm just going to talk about the priority setting partnership that I want to bring together. This kind of was born out of this landmark study that showed that the priorities and treatment goals that doctors might have are sometimes a little bit different to those that are identified by patients. And really what we'd like to do as a group in the UK is bring together the doctors and the patients to set the priorities in the future. And there's a charity called the James Lind Alliance that run priority setting partnerships. They've done this in 95 different disease areas across the board in the UK. So this is a process that takes 12 to 18 months. It brings together patients, carers, healthcare professionals to set the agenda. And at the end of that process, the idea is that you have a list of the top 10 research areas that you want to prioritize to get funding for new research projects in the laboratories and also in clinical trials. So the process is about gathering feedback from patients across the UK, analyzing those data, and then there's a steering group and a workshop that brings together a small number of people to really help set the agenda for the coming years, and you end up with the top 10 priorities for future research in this field. So this is something you'll all be hearing about, I hope, in the next year or so. And you can, if you Google James Lind Alliance, you can read more about how the process works.